You're not confused. That's the story you tell yourself because it's easier than admitting the truth. Confusion sounds passive. It sounds like something is missing, like you just need more time, more clarity, more information. But that's not what's happening. You saw it early, clearly, without needing to analyze it, without needing to think it through. You felt it immediately. Something didn't line up. Something felt off. Something didn't sit right. And instead of acting on that, you paused. You questioned it. You softened it. You gave it more time. Not because you didn't understand what you were seeing, but because you didn't want it to be true. You saw it early, and you knew what it meant. The pattern doesn't start later, it starts immediately. It shows up in small ways that are easy to dismiss if you want to. Inconsistency that you explain away. Tone shifts that you ignore. Small moments that don't match what's being said. You notice it, but you don't treat it as information. You treat it as something that needs to be confirmed. So you wait. You watch. You gather more evidence. But you're not actually looking for clarity. You're looking for a reason to override what you already saw. Because if you accept it early, you have to act early. And acting early means walking away before you've built attachment, before you've invested time, before you've created a version of what this could be. That's the part you avoid. You override your initial response. Your first reaction is usually accurate. It's fast. It's clean. It doesn't need explanation. But instead of trusting it, you slow it down. You bring logic into it. You start asking questions that don't actually serve you. Maybe it's just timing. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you're projecting. Maybe you just need to give it space. That's where the shift happens. You move from recognition to negotiation. And once you start negotiating with your own perception, you've already stepped out of clarity. You call it being fair, but it's avoidance. You tell yourself you're being reasonable, that you don't want to jump to conclusions, that you're trying to understand. But what you're actually doing is avoiding the discomfort of accepting what you already see. Because if you accept it, you lose the version of the situation you were hoping for. You lose the potential. You lose the idea of what it could become. And instead of letting that go early, you delay it. You stretch it out. You give it more time than it deserves. Not because the situation improved, but because you didn't want to let it end. Clarity was never the problem. This is where most people get it wrong. They think they stayed because they didn't have enough clarity. But clarity was there. It was there in the beginning. It just wasn't acted on. You didn't need more information. You needed to trust the information you already had. But trusting it requires action. And action requires letting go. That's the part most people avoid. So instead of acting, you wait. And while you wait, the pattern continues. The longer you stay, the harder it gets. Time doesn't create clarity, it creates attachment. The longer you stay in something, the more invested you become. The more you justify it, the more you adapt to it. And once you've adapted, your perception shifts. What felt off at the beginning starts to feel normal. Not because it changed, but because you adjusted to it. That's how people stay in patterns they originally recognized as misaligned. You already know this pattern. Let's be direct. You've experienced this before. You've had that moment where something didn't feel right. You noticed it, you questioned it, and then you ignored it. You told yourself it wasn't enough to act on. You gave it more time. And eventually, the exact thing you noticed early became the reason it ended. Not because it suddenly appeared, because it was always there. You just delayed responding to it. You're not waiting for clarity, you're waiting for comfort. This is the real mechanism. You're not waiting to understand the situation better. You're waiting until acting feels easier. You're waiting until leaving feels justified enough. You're waiting until the discomfort of staying becomes stronger than the discomfort of leaving. And by the time you reach that point, the cost is higher. More time, more energy, more attachment, more recovery. All because you didn't act when it was simple. You keep hoping it will correct itself. You convince yourself that things will balance out, that what you're seeing now isn't the full picture, that it just needs time. But patterns don't correct themselves. They continue. They repeat. They expand. And what you ignore early becomes more obvious later. Not because it changed, but because it had more time to show itself. You confuse potential with reality. You don't stay for what is. You stay for what it could be. You build a version of the situation that hasn't happened yet. And then you start relating to that version instead of what's actually in front of you. That creates a gap between reality and expectation. And that gap is where you lose clarity. Because now you're not evaluating what's real. You're evaluating what you hope will become real. You start justifying what you originally questioned. Things you noticed early get reinterpreted. You soften them, you explain them, you give them context that makes them easier to accept. And once you do that, you lose your reference point. Because now you're not comparing the situation to your standard. You're adjusting your standard to fit the situation. You lose trust in your own perception. The more you override yourself, the less you trust yourself. Because you keep seeing things and not acting on them. You keep recognizing patterns and staying in them. And over time, that creates hesitation. You stop trusting your initial response, you second guess it, you delay it. And that delay keeps you in the same cycle. You call it confusion, but it's resistance. You're not confused about what's happening. You're resisting what it means. Because once you accept what it means, you have to respond. And response creates change. And change is uncomfortable. So instead of moving, you stay. And you label that state as confusion. The pattern repeats until you interrupt it. This doesn't happen once. It repeats, different situations, same process. You notice early, you override it, you stay. It becomes clear later. And then you leave. And then you do it again. Because the pattern isn't external. It's internal. It's how you respond to what you see. The shift is simple, but not easy. The shift isn't about becoming more aware. You're already aware. It's about acting on that awareness earlier, before you build attachment, before you create exceptions, before you justify what you see. You have to trust your first response. Not every thought, not every reaction, but that initial recognition, that moment where something feels off without explanation. That's information. And the more you act on it, the stronger your clarity becomes. You stop negotiating with what you see. You stop asking if it's enough to matter. You stop waiting for it to become obvious. You treat early signals as valid, and you respond to them without needing confirmation. You always knew. You're not confused. You never were. You saw it. Early, clearly. You just didn't act on it. And until that changes, the pattern will repeat. Not because you don't understand what's happening. Because you keep ignoring what you already know. Thank you for watching. This is MindStickz.